Okay, this is the chapter over Persia. It's called The Middle East United, the Persian Empire, 800 BC to 300 BC. Almost 2,000 years before Genghis Khan and his Mongols forged an empire linking China to Turkey, there was the Persian Empire. 5 centuries before Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon to lay the foundation for the Romans, there was the Persian Empire. 2 centuries before Alexander the Great took his Macedonian warriors to the banks of the Indus River, there was the Persian Empire. The Mongols, the Romans, and the Greeks often get credit for creating the largest land empires, but long before their conquering hordes subdued the known world, it was the Persians who had built the greatest land empire known to man, subjugating peoples from as far away as Greece, Egypt, Babylon, and India. Born in the land we today call Iran, the Persians were the first to connect Europe, Asia, and Africa, creating a paradoxical rule known as much for its unyielding violence and oppressive taxation as for its religious toleration and progressive stance on civil liberties. The Persian Empire started in what today would be known as southern Iranian province of Fars, about 50 miles off the coast of the Persian Gulf and about 500 miles away from the ancient Mesopotamian city of Babylon. In about 600 BC, the Parsi or Farsi people of the southern province were tired of being ruled by the Median people, who taxed them too much, failed to safely protect the countryside, and refused to recognize their own regional lords. As so often happened in the ancient world, these regional lords used a combination of military force and diplomacy to unite neighboring tribes to topple the ineffective ruler. In this case, the regional lord was Cyrus, and once Cyrus had deposed the Median ruler to the north, he united the lands under his Parsi banner. Cyrus then spread his domain through Mesopotamia to the edge of Egypt. Future kings would expand the empire even further, taking Egypt, India, and many of the Greek colonies that had started popping up on the western coast of the land we today call Turkey. Cyrus established a method of government that many actually embraced. He would rule as ultimate leader from afar, and as long as every conquered region paid taxes to Cyrus, he would let local lords, known as satraps, control the day-to-day operations of their province. This meant that locals could keep worshiping their own gods, could keep conducting their same economic transactions, and could keep practicing their local traditions. As long as the money kept rolling in, they would be left alone. Under the rule of Cyrus, then Cambyses, then Darius I, then Xerxes I, then Xerxes II, then Darius II, then Araxes II, III, and IV, and finally with Darius III, the Persian Empire flourished, amassing more riches than any land west of the Indus River, constructing temples and palaces like the Apodian Palace in Persepolis that dwarfed the creations of ancient Greece. Their engineers contracted massive irrigation projects to bring water to their arid valleys and built thousands of miles of roads to connect their vast empire. Their artists polished lavish gardens and lined palace walls with intricate carvings. All of this was made possible by the elaborate and strictly enforced tax system whereby at least 10% of everyone's income, be it in crop or coin, was sent to regional lords, who then transferred a percentage to the Persian king residing in the capital of Persepolis. Some provinces, like Egypt and India, paid more, but everyone paid something. To expedite the collection of taxes, Cyrus revolutionized the monetary system, putting everyone on one standard silver and gold coin system. No longer would there be any discrepancies over the value of currency. Everyone used the king's coin. Aside from founding a uniform system for transacting business, the Persian kings also enumerated a uniform set of laws written down and enforced across the empire. Before Cyrus, laws were flexible, left to the disposition of their local lawgiver, and oftentimes random or unfair. This uniform law system made life more predictable and more possible to have stable business and social contracts. Modern constitutions, bills of rights, and legal contracts owe the Persians for their ingenuity in formalizing regulations. But that was just their good side. They also had a fairly scary bad side. Sure, if you paid the Persians, life was relatively comfy. But if you chose to ignore the compulsory taxes or Ahura the name for their god, forbid, considered rebelling, the Parsi kings would strike down with deadly retribution. Let's just take one instance. In 521 BC, a challenger to the throne, Pheres, led a rebellion that was quickly squashed by the forces of Darius. Darius proceeded to cut off all the rebels' noses, ears, and tongues. He ripped out their eyes. He then rammed poles up the men's arses and propped them up around the city square. If that wasn't enough, he ordered their skin peeled off and then stuffed with straw. After this appetizing little punishment, not too many towns or factions considered breaking away. Persian power was absolute and unquestioned. This is usually where history books start telling the story of Persia. By the 5th century BC, the Persian Empire had become a seemingly monolithic monster from the east, forever threatening to crush the factious city-states of the west. Cyrus and his royal progeny appeared to have unquenchable thirst for conquest, and it appeared only a matter of time before a gluttonous Persian king would set his sights on the Mediterranean peninsula of Hellas. For the West, this couldn't happen. Before Europe could have its golden ages of Greece and Rome, the Persian threat had to be suppressed. The fate of Western civilization stood in the balance. Had Xerxes' forces not first been slowed down by the Spartan 300 and then crushed by the Athenian navy in 480 BC, there never would have been the Europe we know today. Instead, the continent might have merely languished as an insignificant territory under the domain of the oppressive, tyrannical forces of the Middle East. Or that's the way European history books tell the story. Or at least that's how they've told it for the past century. Depicting the Persians as the embodiment of ancient evil reached the pinnacle of preposterousness in the 27 film 300, a recreation of the graphic novel that pitted the uber-macho men of Sparta against the hordes of faceless, mindless, bestial thugs from Persia. For some Westerners, this film was their first and only introduction to ancient Persia. Yet it was the one-sided, demonic depiction of the Persians that so angered segments of the Iranian, modern-day Persian community that Iran's Motion Picture Board actually lodged a formal complaint with the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, for the film's destruction of Iran's heritage. The film presents Xerxes as a sexually deviant, oversized drag queen, a sharp contrast with the viral, buffed-out, idealized Spartan characters. His 1 million troops come across as monstrously disfigured barbarians, of which even the elite immortals bear dagger teeth hidden behind kabuki-esque Halloween masks. Because of this one-dimensional representation of the entire Persian force and their leader, the final battle becomes a conflict between a dedicated free Western army and a despotic, barbaric, slave-owning regime. Director Zack Snyder simply adapted the graphic novel's classic good versus evil conflict, where the victors went on to form the foundation of the superior Western civilization, while the losers retreated to their lives of savagery, subsequently dooming the Middle East to centuries of subservience to their superior neighbors to the West. Unfortunately for the xenophobic audience who need this tale to be true, the reality isn't so tidy. The Persians were in fact historically tolerant and bestowed upon the world a human rights legacy unprecedented by the time. From Cyrus the Great onward, the Persian kings protected a Bill of Rights, even granting freedoms to women not seen elsewhere in the West until the 19th century. Cyrus, grandfather of Xerxes, proclaimed over 2,500 years ago, "I will respect the traditions, customs, and religions of the nations of my empire, and never let any of my governors and subordinates look down on or insult them while I am alive. I will impose my monarchy on no nation. Each is free to accept it, and if any one of them rejects it, I never resolve on war to reign. While I am the king, I will never let anyone oppress others. I will never let anyone take possession of movable and landed properties of the others by force or without compensation. While I am alive, I will prevent unpaid forced labor. Today I announce that everyone is free to choose a religion. No one could be penalized for his or her relatives' faults." This declaration dealt with land claims, religious affiliation, women's rights, meritocracy, and personal freedoms. Although many historians trace the American Bill of Rights to English tradition or even Athenian democracy, in reality, one needs to look further back to Persia, where the notion of individual freedoms was first protected by a political leader. And unlike the not so flattering Western perception of today's Iran and the Middle East, the Persia of Cyrus and Xerxes' time was highly tolerant of religions. In fact, it was Cyrus the Great who was responsible for releasing Jews from their Babylonian captivity. Prior to their release, for close to a century, the Jews had been exiled from their native Judea, modern-day Israel, forced to live as prisoners of the Babylonians. Yet Cyrus respected all religions and refused to hold the Jews prisoners in a foreign land. Isn't it ironic that today's Iranian leaders spew mountains of anti-Semitic vitriol, even threatening to blow Israel off the map when it was their political predecessors that reopened Israel to the Jews in the first place? The Persian leaders of today might be less tolerant, but the Persian founders saw the value of an inclusive society that protected personal beliefs. The relative inclusiveness of the Persian society makes Snyder's film depiction of Persians as slaveholders even more preposterous. No archaeological evidence exists to prove widespread acceptance of slavery, and in fact, the Persian Empire became the promised land for slaves escaping captivity from northern Africa, southern Europe, and the Middle East. This is not to say the Persian Empire was free of violence, corruption, and inhumane treatment, but to claim that they were any more uncivilized than the rest of the classic world is a historical inaccuracy. And as for the much-aligned Xerxes, he was actually a bearded, heterosexual emperor married to Esther, a leading advocate for Jewish freedoms, a far cry from the effeminate 10-foot-tall, body-pierced creature that greets Leonidas in the film 300. Why then has recent history depicted the Persian in such a negative light? Much of this portrayal can be traced back to the Greek historian Herodotus, from whom much of our knowledge of early Greece comes. Prior to the 1850s, the primary historical text, the Bible, and the work of Greek author Xenophon championed the role of Cyrus the Great in the Persian empires. But toward the middle of the 19th century, Western historians needed to devalue the importance of monarchical rule. As the United States and France emerged triumphantly, as the United States and France emerged triumphantly from the imperial control, historians sought out historical interpretations that glorified the role of democracy. Under this filter, republican governments were good, monarchies were evil. Fortunately, the text of Herodotus presented the Greeks in such a light, underdogs fighting insurmountable numbers, armed not only with determination and undying effort, but with firmly ingrained democratic values. Since this time, future historians have followed this Eurocentric model established by the father of history, and subsequent Western texts have veered little from his analysis. Ironically, Herodotus, the champion of everything Greek, chose the Persian Empire to live, write, and publish his text, for it was there that he was granted the artistic freedom to express his views without fear of retribution. Yet the Persians lost any chance of historical recognition for their contributions to liberal government the moment they decided to push their empire further west into the land of the Greeks. From this point forward, they became the West's greatest nemesis, an enemy that would have to be dehumanized and disparaged to better demonstrate the glory and virtue of the Greek way of life. For when the two cultures finally clashed, only one can survive, and the winner went the credit for introducing equality and freedom to the world. But that's for another chapter. Okay, this was the chapter over the Persian Empire. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks.